Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's session of the Popular Music Books in Process series, a collaboration between the Journal of Popular Music Studies, IASPM US, and the POP Conference. My name is Gus Stadler, and I co-organize the series along with Elena Razlogova, Alex Vasey, Eric Weisbard, and Carl Wilson. Our other organizers, Kimberly Mack, Antonia Randolph, and Francesca Royster, are currently on sabbatical from their work with us, and we hope to see them return soon. Um, Please note that you can see all of the previous sessions on Eric Weisbard's YouTube channel, and you'll be able to see today's later tonight or tomorrow. Um, 2 weeks from today at this time, Franz Nicolay, the writer and musician, will be talking about his just released book, Band People, Life and Work in Popular Music, which is published with the American Music Series at University of Texas Press, and he'll be in conversation with Steve Hayden. But today, Glenn McDonald is with us, and he and Carl Wilson will discuss Glenn's new book, You Have Not Yet Heard Your Favorite Song, How Streaming Changes Music. Uh, and and they'll be discussing other topics in the technological and algorithmic mediation of music distribution and listening and love. A little bit about our conversants. Glenn McDonald is a music evangelist and algorithm designer. He created the music exploration website Every Noise at Once, and for 12 years was the data alchemist at the Echo Nest and Spotify. He is the former tabulator of the Village Voice Paz and Jop Music Critics Poll, a frequent pop conference speaker, and he's written about music online since before blog was a word. You've Not Yet Heard Your Favorite Song is his first offline book. Carl Wilson is the music critic at Slate and author of the acclaimed book, Let's Talk About Love, A Journey to the End of Taste. A Toronto-based freelance writer and editor, he has also published in Book Forum, Billboard, The New York Times, Oxford American, The Atlantic, and many other venues. He's currently working on a book about the late songwriter and poet David Berman for W. W. Norton, and his newsletter, Critic, can be found at https://carlwilson.substack.com. So I will turn things over to Glenn and Carl, and after about 45 minutes or so of their conversation, there will be Q&A session. As you're watching the conversation, please put your questions in the chat as they come to you. You're also welcome to use the chat just to make comments. And I think with that, I will turn it over to Glenn.
Hi, everybody. It's Glenn, and I'm here in a very small closet in the co-working space in Cambridge, and I'm glad so many people have shown up. So I wrote a book, and the way it happened was I worked for Spotify for a long time, and I wrote about a bunch of stuff while I was at Spotify. One of my coworkers once said to me, how do you get permission to talk to people? Because whenever I ask, they tell me no. And I looked at him, said, "There, that's you just answered your question." I tried not to ask for permission because if you ask corporations for permission, they just will say no. So instead, I just wrote about stuff because I wanted to. And I'm a although yes, I started writing what I called a music column. Went back before blog was a thing, and then blog meant weblog, which was like a list of links, and then eventually it came to mean just personal writing, and I've definitely been doing that. So I've lived in this world of like write, maybe proofread for a couple of minutes, and then hit publish, and that's fun. But those things form little disjointed bits of thoughts. And I've long had in my mind that I should try to organize some thoughts into a longer form. And sometime before the pandemic hit, I got a random unsolicited email from a literary agent saying, I've seen your website. Have you ever thought about writing a book? I said, sort of. And they sort of talked me through just writing down all the stories that I usually tell. And then the pandemic happened and the literary agent vanished. And I just sort of fiddled with this outline I had a little bit more. Then a few months later, a different literary agent also cold emailed me saying, "Hey, have you ever thought about writing a book?" And I said, "Well, I have this outline." And so second agent helped me organize the outline and write some sample chapters. And we sent it out. And pretty much the unanimous response from publishers and editors was that it was kind of set up as a memoir, and I wasn't famous enough for anybody to want to read my memoir, which I sympathized with. So then I actually tried to organize it into something of an argument. And along the way, I read lots of articles and books about technology and music and streaming. And my experience is they're mostly written by journalists, and the journalists mostly don't know how the internals of streaming works, understandably. And so they mostly quote people who might know, but they also might have grudges or corporate agendas more than they are interested in explaining what's really happening. And over the course of doing this for 12 years, I learned a lot about what was really happening. Not company secrets, which are mostly not interesting or I didn't know them, but just like how the whole thing worked. And I also believe in the value of streaming for music and the value of music streaming for humanity. And I wanted there to be a book that would tell the story of how it really worked from the perspective of someone who thought it was good, that it was, on the whole, good that it was working. And eventually I realized that was me. So the book is set up, there's like some intro to sort of put where we are now in context, but it's mostly set up as a tour through the various fears that streaming engenders in people, and then a corresponding tour through the wonders that streaming makes possible. I think it's very easy to sell fear. It's a little harder to sell love. But I think it's best when you try to do them both, because many times fears are reasonable, sometimes they're unreasonable, sometimes they're reasonable but wrong, and they all ought to be put in better context. So since writing the book, it's been fun because I've talked to a bunch of very different audiences, classes of audiences. I talked to technology people for whom this is a book about technology and algorithms, and music is the example domain. And then I talked to artists and music business people for whom the book is a bunch of insights into the music industry with some geeky stuff about technology strewn in. And the pop conference slash this audience is this is the first time I've talked to an audience of people who think about books about music. And mine is it's sort of a book about music in the same way that it's sort of a book about technology and sort of a book about everything. So here we are.
Is this the point where you want me to step in, Glenn?
That was a dramatic pause. We're very well rehearsed, Carl and I, to pick up on each other's cues.
Um, okay. So definitely one of the things that is the strength of the book, I think, is the way that it really systematically breaks down different categories of the things that people worry about with streaming. And a lot of the time it feels like you're refuting kind of unnamed critics um, who tend to wax apocalyptic about the effects of streaming on music and on artists in particular, but on listeners as well. So I want to play that straw man a little bit for part of this and give you the opportunity um, and try to voiced what I think for a lot of our crowd of music critics and scholars um, may well be kind of not completely technically versed fears and apprehensions, but are things that we feel like we've observed in the past decade or so of streaming becoming the dominant medium. And I'll go through them sort of categorically. Some of them definitely overlap. I have a section of about 5 questions in the middle where I'm like, these are all the same question, and yet I want to ask each of them, so I'm not quite sure what to do there. So I have like 20
Sounds
questions,
fine.
which we won't get through, but I'll start and see where it goes. And you please feel free to take tangents and tell stories that go beyond whatever the basic thing that I ask is.
Right.
Um, so I thought because it's the most dominant conversation within among music people, that we should start with the economic question. And one point you make a few times, and I think it's really worth making, is that the average person spent a lot less on music during the physical media era than we might guess. You give the figure of $25 to $60 a year, although that's a little confusing because those amounts mean very different things depending on when in that era you're talking about. If $25 in the 70s and $25 in the 2000s are very different things. But still, if we look at everything that people are spending on streaming subscriptions, given that most people use the free service, some people don't stream at all. Large numbers of people don't stream at all. And music devotees streaming, they may spend on music in other ways. They might buy LPs still, whatever. But if we just imagine them as streaming customers, if they're paying their $10+ a month, they're spending a lot less than they would have spent in the CD era. You give yourself as an example, you might have spent $1,500 a year easily on CDs, and now that's $120.
Yep.
So it seems like there's a smaller pool of money still, so that the answer of streaming as filling in all of what's lost when we lost that economy of physical media feels shaky to me. And I guess the other question is, you say that money is increasingly being spread more evenly among artists and not just the top 1%. And I think that's contrary to what a lot of us have gotten the impression of over recent years and studies that we've seen. So please tell us, critical and suspicious music types and people who want to be allies of artists, what you think we should know about the real economics of streaming.
Okay, so it's very hard to assess the overall effects by multiplying individuals because I mean the 25 to 60 is, yeah, like you say, it's a wide range even at any point in time, let alone over that era. So I mean, when we got acquired by Spotify years ago, I had to decide for myself, like, is this okay or evil? And the main way I could think to do that was to look at the overall size of the industry. So the RIAA has a great database you can look at that has the revenue per format from 1970 to the present. And it tells the very familiar story that which is the CD era was this great peak, and then Napster killed it, and then get my hand on the screen, and then paid downloads did not quite rescue it, and then streaming brought it back up. And if you just go there and don't touch anything, you see that the graph goes up higher than it did, and you think, oh, it's wonderful, until you realize that there's a little button you click to adjust for inflation, and then it's not quite back to the peak. But we're not quite as far into the streaming era as the CD peak was in the CD era. So it's still basically reasonable to think that the streaming might bring at least the American recorded music industry back to about the peak and maybe higher than it was. Now, if you're trying to assess that morally, you have to ask, like, was the CD peak like the moral, like, correctness? Like, Or was that inflated by the fact that CD prices were artificially high and people rebought a lot of things they had on LP? But whatever, if you just take it as a given, then streaming, even when I did this the first time and we were several years earlier in streaming, it was like, yeah, okay, it's if it feels like we're not back to the golden era, that's because we're not, but the trajectory is reasonable. Um, so so that's one thing. The distribution, if you, so I could, at Spotify, I could look at very good data for the streaming era and then very bad data for before the streaming era. But the one thing I did to try to assess this distribution was spent several days in a laborious exercise of looking at the charts through the 80s and 90s and cross-referencing gold and platinum certifications, because then I had some dates with sales numbers on them. And I could, it's like a Fermi problem, like it's a lot of estimation, but I could kind of get a sense of what percentage of the industry the top 100 artists, like the end of the year Hot 100, represented over time. And then within the streaming era, I could do that in great detail for year over year. And yeah, in both cases, pre-streaming versus streaming and year over year consistently throughout the streaming era, the percentage controlled by the very top is going down. Now, it's still high and it's going down slowly. And Daniel Ek once stated that Spotify's goal was to get 1 million artists making a living from their music. And when he said that internally at Spotify in a town hall meeting, we have Slido for asking questions, and the question I put in Slido, which was not answered in public, was, where are we now? Like, if you think we're going to get to 1 million artists, what's that figure currently? Like, what does Spotify think the number of artists making a living from Spotify? And of course, he didn't know the answer because he hadn't asked me, and I'm the one who would find out the answer. But I went and found out the answer, and it was like 15,000 or something. So it was like not nobody, but it wasn't going to get to 1 million anytime soon. But so both, like, the fear is reasonable because I mean, why is it 1 million? I don't know. Progress is slow, but it is progress. So streaming it's not made the total music business worse, and it's not making it incrementally worse over time. Those are my two statistical economic observations. So none of that means that doesn't answer any other questions, in my opinion. That doesn't resolve any of the moral questions or determine what the revenue model should be or anything like that. But it is at least at base like, okay, there's something to work with. It's clearly not worse than the industry was before. So let's just assume that it's about the same. And if you look around and see that most of the power structure is the same on the, at least before you get to the new tech companies, then it all seems like, all right, we're still doing this. Nothing, all the good questions remain to be answered.
Yeah, and obviously we could talk a lot more about that, but I'll leave that to the Q&A. But I do think it's interesting, that counterintuitive idea that actually despite the way it may look, because we're seeing metrics in different ways than we used to see them, that there isn't some new massive counterbalance in favor of superstars, just as there isn't a new massive counterbalance in favor of the so-called long tail, which people thought about before this actually came into being, really, right? And my second question is kind of along those lines, and also what you were saying at the end about power structures. There's a place in the book where you seem to suggest that maybe over the long run, and this is in accord with what people fantasized about before streaming really came into existence, that labels as mediators might wither away. and that there'd be more of a situation where artists would connect more directly with fans through streaming platforms, and that labels wouldn't control licensing in the same ways, and um and that yeah, that they wouldn't continue to play the role that they played in the pre-streaming economy. But it feels a little bit like if that collapse were going to happen, it would have come in the worst years, like 2004 to 2014, somewhere in there. And now streaming's relationship with labels is kind of set in, embedded in the structure, because the deals between labels and a site like Spotify are what makes Spotify work in a lot of ways, right? So how can that change? And how is it possible for a more so-called organic virality to ever compete with gatekeepers with promotional budgets? Is there a way that we can get from the power structure perpetuating that we have now to something that it feels intuitively like the internet should enable?
Yes. So, I mean, I think it's worth making the point, which is slightly semantic, that uh, labels are that's not quite the word. We're not really
Right.
worried about labels. We're worried about corporations.
Yeah.
So I think indie labels, the label as a community of artists, I think is a powerful construct. Universal is not a community of artists in the same way that, say, Profound Lore is. Um, so yes, we remain in the era where Sony and Universal and Warner control not no longer most of the music, but most of the musical attention. And although they don't control distribution and they don't control record stores, they still mostly control, like you say, marketing budgets and therefore access to radio and TV placements and advertising placements and so most of those things. So most of the music you're going to hear just wandering around in the world is still major label music, and thus most of the listeners that you are trying to reach, if you are an artist, major label or not, are mostly major label listeners just because they have to be. And it it was appealing to imagine in the very early days of streaming that the streaming services were going to be the thing that takes this structure apart. And of course, licensing means that they cannot be. So if you want to be, I mean, there's an alternate timeline where all the streaming services just said, all right, we're only going to have the music that is willing to be new and start here, and we're going to begin all over with our own little worlds and fight against fight the number battle and say, all right, you've got 100 artists, Universal, fine. We'll have 10,000 and we'll try to get people to come listen to these artists that they've never heard of instead of the famous ones. That probably would have failed, but maybe it would have been different. But we didn't get that. So what we have instead is it's now technically possible to go around the labels, and that doesn't in itself change much, but it does make this slow erosion of their complete control possible, and it makes individual success stories possible, and it means that people can see those stray success stories and that informs their dreams. Now, the downside is there's now a corresponding economy meant to prey on the spread of dreams. And so you have all these indie distributors who are mostly making money off of artists who are not mostly making money. how is it all going to change? I think the way any of these things change is someone drives a little crack into the edifice somewhere. And at the time when it happens, it's not obvious that that crack is structural. And by the time it becomes obvious that it's structural, it's too late to fix it. So I got laid off by Spotify in December, and I spent the next 6 months talking to everyone that I could talk to. And in that process, talked to a, an impressive array of earnest startups who were trying to rebuild some little part of the music industry in a more principled way. And most of those efforts will fail individually, but not all of them will. And some of them may sow the seeds for the big change that gets us out of this cycle. And we will, and so maybe they won't. It's hard. It's hard upending entrenched power structure, but we have ways around them now. So
That's exciting to imagine all of these people, all these little guerrilla startups out there. I'm going to come back to some of the sort of streaming controversies, but let's talk about something more fun for a bit. Let's talk about genre. One of the most famous things that you produced, of course, is the Every Noise at Once map, which is still up on your website, everynoise.com, although it's not fed by data in the same kind of real-time way that it was when you had access to Spotify's back end. But if people haven't looked at this, it's extraordinary. It's an interactive plotting of thousands of subgenres and sub-subgenres according to some features, but also according to things that they have in common. And it can feel like sort of an X-ray of all the world's music that you can manipulate. And one of the things I love most in the book is when you talk about what you learned about genre from having to invent math that would explain it when it really is not a thing that suits math very well. So talk a little bit about how you learn to draw the lines and what the signals are that let you know when something qualified as a subgenre. You know, you could take things to an absurd and be like every artist could be a subgenre in one way. Um, and how did you decode the terms that those artists, communities of artists and listeners were using to describe themselves? And what kind of pushback did you get because artists hate being classified by genre? I'd love to hear about that a little bit.
yeah, so this it's probably useful to understand that this effort began totally tactically in that the Equinest, before we were acquired by Spotify, we were a little startup trying to get business to business customers. So we did recommendations and radio generation and stuff like that. And we were trying to do that for companies who needed that. And at the time, this was sort of early Pandora era before most people had had experience with uh, like on-demand streaming services. So track-based and artist-based radio were sort of the standard thing. That's what most of our potential customers asked us for. But then we had one, and I don't even remember who it was, who was like, "That's too complicated. We just want like a dozen big buttons, and it says rock, and you hit the button and it plays rock." And we were like kind of full of ourselves. So we were like, yes, yes, well, that is a very simplistic way of looking at it. But we know what you mean is the most popular artist for whom rock is a commonly occurring descriptive term. And we have a corpus of descriptive blah, blah, blah. And anyway, we'll have it for you on Wednesday. And so we went back to the office and fired up our fancy configurable engine and said to play us the most popular artist that people describe as rock because we scraped all the pages on the web that could possibly be that music. And we hit play, and out came Rihanna. And we were like, hmm, well, it's reasonable. People do use the word rock when they're talking about Rihanna. That's not that uncommon, but we're pretty sure that wasn't what these potential customers wanted to hear when they hit rock. And what was quickly evident as we looked at the data was the question of what words describe an artist is a very different question from the one of what artists typify a genre, even when the word in question is also the name of the genre. And so this was like Friday, and we had till Wednesday, and we had a lot of data, and we had a table of interns from Tufts in the corner. And I was like, okay, so if we just have the interns, like, these aren't complicated genres, just have the interns like go find 5 or 10 canonical artists, just like from Wikipedia or whatever, like, not, it's not complicated or subtle. Just go find the artist that people probably mean when they say each of these dozen things. And then we have this great artist similarity graph, and we'll do some sort of, I'll figure this out, collective extrapolation with math from those seeds. And if the artists who are similar to all the most canonical rock artists are probably the rock artists. And so we like madly did that data setup and some math, and it's like, yeah, okay, this is basically working. It's at least more rock than what we're getting the other way. So then we just kept doing it. And I remember one of our product managers said, oh, we should probably have like 100 of these when we, turn it on in our API. And I'm like, 100? I'm going for 400. And when I got to 400, I was like, there's there's definitely 500. There might be six. And when I got to 800, I'm like, there could be 1,000. And after 1,000, I'm like, all right, it's pointless. It's pointless to try to guess. But what I only slowly realized from the exercise of doing it was what I was doing. Like, I didn't begin with a theoretical grounding. It's just like, we need this. And then I just kept doing it. And what I realized was that I was basically trying to find all the communities of listening in the world. And I discovered that, you know, genres are communities. They're communities of artists, they're communities of listeners. Often they're both. Usually there's some element of musical rationale to them. But if you look at the front page of everynoise.com for 5 seconds, you can tell that my notion of genre is not a classical musicological thing like ragtime is this rhythm and these instruments in this era. It's much broader than that. And the interesting thing, sort of unprecedented thing, was because I had all this listening data, I could find clusters of listening that did not yet self-identify as communities. And to me, this was really, really cool. And I wanted to show those communities to themselves. And if they didn't have a name, then I made them up. And I tried to make up the most boring and descriptive names possible. And I was usually successful, but not always. So there were occasional fanciful ones just because I could not for the life of me think of anything else. And first time I had a glimpse of sort of what was going to happen to me because of this was in Wrapped, Spotify Wrapped, the end of the year, one year. The marketing team at Spotify, and understand that Wrapped at Spotify is a brand exercise. Like, it masquerades as a data exercise and like a storytelling thing, but the success criteria for Spotify is all about virality and brand presence.
And we should just
So
stop for a second, say, for people who might not know, that Wrapped is the thing that Spotify sends out at the year that tells you what your favorite music that year was supposed to have been.
right. And so it has a thing where it tells you your top genres. And I either did the data collection for that or directed it every year I was there. And anyway, so one year this, and it always in conjunction with the thing that tells you, the listener, about your year, there's a bunch of like stories about the world and marketing things. And so one of them this year was a story about the genre of the year. And the genre of the year, which the marketing department picked, was a genre called Metropolis. And I made up the name, and I didn't know that they were going to pick it, and they didn't discuss it with me. And apparently they didn't know that I hadn't made up the genre exactly. And I never really made up genres, but I definitely made up the name. And that was the moment I'm like, oh, I'm not just making up these names like for my obscure web page. Like people are going to hear about this, and I'm just going to have to be okay with that because I wanted to be able to show people these things. And when people would be like, it says this is my favorite genre, but I've never heard of it, I could answer very confidently, yeah, that's why you got it, because it's a thing and it didn't have a name and I gave it a name and now you know. And every time people went and then looked at the playlist that says what it was, they would be like, oh, oh, it's that. You're right. That's my music. It's my music. You've got made a playlist of my music and you called it Metropolis. And yeah, so I got a little crap for Metropolis that year, and I got a lot of more crap for Escape Room a few years later, which was definitely my most complete failure to think of a descriptive name.
Yeah.
But I'm happy with that. My favorite name of that set was Laboratorio, which was music that sounds like it was made in a laboratory as opposed to on a stage. And that name came from I went to see Sigur Rós, and Amina, Icelandic band, was opening up, and they they play music, but they're not like standing on the edge of the stage with instruments. They're just like wandering around. Like they don't actually have beakers. They're not actually pouring things into beakers, but it's twisting knobs. It's as close as you can get to just like puttering around in a chemical laboratory, and music was coming out. So Laboratorio, that's the one I was most fond of.
Yeah, and we should say, a lot of the time you went digging around to find out what people called the music before you got there, and it was only when you couldn't find an answer that you did those kinds of things. But it is interesting. It's like one of those points where you were performing a critical function, which is, so traditionally people will like write a magazine feature and go, I found all these things that have this thing in common. It's a trend. I'm calling it post rock. I'm Simon Reynolds, and then people go like, what the fuck is post rock supposed to be? And then that battle happens and things
Yep.
either stick or they don't. Um, this is a bit of a tangent from the genre question, but it fits in a little bit, I think, because of the story you tell to illustrate it, which is about bias in the algorithms or the way that algorithms reproduce bias. Um, and the example you give is of Martina McBride, who complained when she wanted to create a playlist called Country on Spotify that the recommendations Spotify offered before she had started building the playlist were something like 130 songs by men before there was a song by a woman. And obviously this ties into the way that, it's been talked about a lot with AI, that recommendation algorithms and AI derive their data from the world as it exists, which is full of biases like sexism and racism. And unless somebody stops them from doing so, they have a tendency to reproduce that. So I guess my question is, can streamers and data alchemists intervene in an activist way in that? And, can the metadata be changed so that they include more information about things like race and gender and so on? And can algorithms be mandated to select for diversity? And what are the upsides and downsides of that? And would engineers do it? And would the corporations be willing to do it? Like, what are the potentials there to correct for this problem?
Yes, it is very hard to fix those things by adjusting knobs and algorithms, not least because many of the algorithms in use don't really have knobs. If I did them, they had knobs, but lots of them were not done by me, and they're done with machine learning and they don't have knobs, and you can't do anything about it. The key to me, just two things: what to do instead of trying to fix the world, but really the key to me is a step back, which is almost none of these things should be called recommendations. Like there is no sense in which you should listen to anything because math or machine learning or a streaming service says you should. That is just like not a concept. You should listen to whatever you want to listen to. If the tools can help you find more of that, can help you understand what a community is and what else is in it and where it leads and what's next to it, that's awesome. And most of the same algorithms that are put under the heading of recommendation can be, if they can be turned around, they can be used to facilitate exploration. But exploration is an act. Like you don't you don't sit still and have exploration brought to you. Like Christopher Columbus did not settle into a couch in Portugal and have the islands of the world brought past his nose. Like you have to go do things. And it's not just a moral thing, it's that you change how you receive things. So if you're listening to a playlist that says it's your favorites and it's playing you the kind of thing that you like, and in the middle of it, it plays a black metal song and you're not a black metal fan, then you're like, but algorithm's broken. Something went wrong. This is not my music. If a friend of yours came over and said, "Hey, I've discovered this weird, amazing stuff called black metal, and it's not the kind of thing that you usually listen to, but let me play you this because it's really weird and amazing." Then you might be like, okay, or you might be like, okay, but you know something weird's going to happen, and you listen to it in a different way. And when you go out and explore, you activate all those like curiosity receptors, and you approach the music in a different way. So recommendation is not only the wrong word, but it's the wrong model to me. That and exploration is a way to turn all those things around. Now that I mean, it doesn't solve the bias. It doesn't try to solve the bias problems. It basically tries to tell you the biases. Like it's all about bias. The thing that I always wanted to know was, yeah, exactly. What's different about this audience from anybody else? What is about the listeners in the Philippines and the rest of the world? What's different about black metal fans from the rest of the world? I want I want to magnify that, not because it's necessarily virtuous, but because those are people and that's what's different about them and that's what's interesting to find out. And in many cases, you find out what's different about things and you're like, that's different and I don't like it. Like, I don't, that's interesting food. And now I've tasted it and maybe I'll go back and eat some fried chicken now. But maybe you're like, that was weird. And then the next time you're like, okay, I see how this taste works. And then later you're like, okay, now it snapped into focus for me. And now I know what this means. So I was never afraid of the bias thing as a problem for the algorithms, but I was totally afraid of it as a problem for the interface design and for the story that a technology tells to its users about how it thinks they should be living their life and relating to the technology.
Yeah, I feel like that leads directly into the cluster of questions I had around the a general problem. Um, and that I guess I would define as engagement versus fostering passivity and and the effect that that has on music in the long run. And the example I'll give is, at one point in the book, you tell the story of having decided at some point years ago, to a couple of decades ago, that you wanted to learn more about classical music, and spending a couple of years digging and reading and buying things. Again, this is all sort of pre-streaming and pre-downloading. Um, and you say, obviously it's true, that you could have gone through that process with streaming so much more quickly. You could have found all of those things. But when you talk about exploration, when you say go do things, um, at one point you had to go do things, right? Like the only way to explore was to go to the record store and flip through things and try and find the things you were looking for and read about things. And, rather than clicking from one point to another. And my question is, like, would you have learned about classical music in the same depth if you were quickly clicking through streaming on things, and would you have listened the same way? And I'm speaking to this partly from my own experience as a listener. I'm a listener who always, we could talk about your your jazz position in a lot of this book, but as a listener to a lot of avant-garde jazz and experimental music and all of these things, a lot of the music that I've been invested in has always required some patience and some effort to sort of grasp what's going on. And I find, and maybe it's partly age, but I think it's also what the medium fosters, that having the skip button there, and particularly being able to like jump 3 minutes ahead in a track that might be 17 minutes long. Um, I'm so tempted to do that so often, to go like, oh, well, but where's the meat of it? What's it going to sound like when they get through this buildup and all of this kind of thing? And I'm robbing myself of actually listening to the way that the musicians made the music. And I'm compressing time, and I'm gamifying the music in some ways, and all of these kinds of things. And so people have talked about this effect, and they've talked about it as musicification, as like music becoming background music, as music needing to cater to our attention spans more, and you have to start with the hook. You can't have an intro anymore. Um, there's the term Spotify core has been thrown around. There are all these discussions about the effect that streaming structurally has on music. And I feel like in the book, you're a little sanguine about this. And you kind of say like, well, you just don't have to do any of that. But I think, we also don't have to watch dumb videos and play stupid games on our phones, but the neurological effects of these things means that we do those things. So address that cluster of fears about engagement.
Well, yes. So I learned about classical music in a different way than I would have, but I don't feel like it was better. Like it wasn't actually deeper or broader because both dimensions were hard. So what it was much more arbitrary. And I found a few things that I liked, but from a fairly small sample. And then I dug in a little bit farther on each of those things. And so I ended up with this not very deep knowledge. I mean, I knew some things before. So it like, okay, I was like a sort of plausible classical music listener and like a Hilliard ensemble fan. And and that's fine. But I have discovered so many more things in more breadth and more depth in streaming than I ever did in all the time before that. And I'm 57, so I had a lot of time before a healthy amount of time in my life trying to hear all the world's music before streaming. So I feel okay about that. Now, yeah, I mean, I think the allure of just letting a drone of lo-fi beats mutter away in the background while you flip through cat videos and DoorDash fast food, like all those things are true. And yeah, it's it's correct to say that as individuals you do not have to do it, and totally correct to say that the aggregate pressure on like blaming it on individuals is exactly what the corporations want you to do, right? They do not want to have to account for their role in facilitating the ways in which we don't want to live but end up living. And to me, the emphasis on machine learning at Spotify, and especially on the kind of machine learning that is trained on result metrics, is that's exactly how you get that effect. If people pick music, if you assign people who know like music to pick music, like editorial playlists, or even, I mean, I was not at no point in the genre exercise was I exercising my own judgment. Like it was not my job to say what was good reggae versus not good reggae. It was just my job to find the reggae. But if you turn that over to machine learning and just make it so that people do whatever the metric is, more time, more songs, more. It's usually those two. You want it to be like, from a business point of view, you want it to be retention. You want it to be people keep paying. But it's really hard to do a test of that because it needs to run for a really long time and nobody has the patience for that. So most of the tests are on the number of plays or the number of listens or the number of long sessions or something like that that can be measured. At the end of each day, you can measure what happened with your test. And so in my time in Spotify, I had a lot of this cycle of somebody triumphantly announced that they'd run an A/B test of something, a new algorithm, a tweak or something, and it had raised one of these metrics by 0.5%. And it's really hard, like any measurable amount of change across 500 million people listening is really hard. So like 0.5% sounds ridiculous. And it is ridiculous, but it's unusually high. Like that's a justifiable triumph in the metrics world. And I would always say when I saw those, like, all right, tell me what changed. And someone would look at me blankly and say, well, listening time went up by 0.5%. And I'd say, all right, these are playlists. There's songs. We're giving people songs. Most people listen to like 5 or 10, just because you've got this graph that shows me what the session length is. So you think you created an algorithm that makes people listen to 7 more seconds of a song? It doesn't even make sense. Like, the algorithm is not changing the song, so that's not what happened. So what did happen? Some people listened more, some people listened less. Did old people get turned off, but the young people liked it better? Did we play more hip hop and less pop, more metal and less reggae? Like, something happened. Like, you know, all the amount of streaming data is big data, but music is pretty small data compared to like language models or other things. Because you listen for an hour a day, that's like 20 songs, 20 pieces of data. That's small. So that means it's almost always understandable. Even it's a black box algorithm that's making the playlist, you can aggregate the results and say, all right, something got played more, something got served more, something got played more. Tell me what it is. And that, if you want to use that information to make more engaging, more active listening ecosystem, you can. And someday we will have a service that does, but the ones we have now are not necessarily motivated to do that as a whole.
I think we should wrap up and let people ask questions. I have 100 more questions. One thing I'll append just to that is that one of the things that is attractive about the book is that you're so future oriented in the way that your answer just now was. Sometimes as a critic and as the kind of listener I am, I feel like the past gets short shrift. And, one of the things that people might have questions about are things like contextual information, liner notes, and their place, archives, all of these kinds of things. People might want to ask things about that, because those are some of the themes of things that I've saw. But Alex, I think you're taking over here.
Thanks, Carl. So we have a few questions in the chat. The first one came from Carl Miller, who had a question about revenue.
What's the question?
Glenn, I just want to say I'm really excited for this book. I've seen you present many times and always fascinated by what you have to say. This goes back to the earliest question by Carl, the other Carl, about revenue and about the size of the music business. And can you give us any insight into how the streaming model versus the previous model accrues revenue to artists rather than to corporations? Are artists getting the money?
That's mostly the same. Like most of those artists, most of the money goes to the major labels. Most of the artists on those labels have their streaming payouts are controlled by the same contracts that controlled their CD royalties and their iTunes download store royalties. So there's been like a little progress in slightly better record deals and like people getting forgiven for not recouping, decades old albums. But on the whole, that part of the economy is about the same. I think terms are getting much better in smaller labels, and now you have the option of doing an indie distro. So you as an artist can set yourself up for the potential of getting a much bigger share of your revenue, but I get a I get 85% of my revenue, and my lifetime earnings from my songs is rapidly approaching $5. So the amount, the percentage is not always that helpful. But it's not worse because it's mostly the same contracts. So it's mostly the same.
Thank you.
Our next question is from Jennifer Lena. She wanted to know about the radio channels project.
Yeah, this is pulling out a very random, probably small project for you, but it stuck in my memory years ago, at least 5, probably a lot more than that. You were playing around with radio channels that would introduce listeners to unfamiliar songs. And I remember that there were 3 channels, like very unlike your stuff, sort of unlike your stuff, pretty close to what you listen to, but still new to you. And I remember that you abandoned the project. And so I've always been curious about why. And at a deeper level, my question is about what you've learned in your prior work at Spotify about what it takes to nudge someone's tastes.
Yeah, so I mean, I think this to me is very much in the same realm of recommendations versus exploration, and feeding people novelty is hard. And I basically came to believe that it was counterproductive to try to that I was trying to wedge exploration into a passively receptive model, and thus missing the activity that made exploration. If it also it kind of worked if you can label things. So I had a bunch of internal playlists that I ran at Spotify, and in addition to giving you the playlist, I would also have a page on my internal website where you could see an annotated view of that playlist. And so, like, there was one that took the countries that you listen to music from and recommended a few things that were sort of like that from each of those countries. And it was much, much more interesting to see that explained on a web page. And you see, like, these 5 artists are from Guatemala. Because if you're just listening, you're like, well, they're talking in Spanish, but that's all I know. And then there's 5 more artists, like there's 15 artists in a row talking in Spanish, rapping in Spanish. And the web page would tell you, these are from Guatemala and these are Bolivian. And then you know that you're being shown a thing. Like, there's context there. And the Spotify playlist interface still to this day has no way to explain context like that. So there are a bunch of things that I wanted to be able to do, but I didn't have the tools to reach people with the right information for them to have that experience.
May I ask a brief follow-up clarification question, or is that inappropriate?
Okay with me.
So yeah, because okay, so then you have all this network data, oh, maybe you don't know which listeners are in IRL connected to other listeners. Did you have any of that information, associational data?
No. Well, you have a little bit if people follow each other on Spotify, but people mostly don't use that feature. So you basically don't have that information.
Got it. So am I clear that your argument would be we would need information like that in order to produce some kind of meaningful nudge in tastes? Because the liner notes, I think, or the narration of the playlist, it makes sense to me that provides richer context for some kinds of listeners, but there are many different kinds of forms of exploration, some more intellectual than others. So I'm trying to get to that bigger class of types of experiment or types of explorers. And am I right in thinking that's your argument, that we'd need that associational data?
No, I mean, you could do different things with that data, but you could do a lot with shared artists and shared place and cities and countries and genres. All that stuff is not, those aren't the only ways that listening is organized, but they're all ways in which, culture is organized and communities are organized. And if and all of those things had playlists. Like I generated thousands and thousands of playlists for cities and countries and genres and colleges and demographic slices and stuff. And those were all very interesting and ways to learn about bits of culture. Turning those into like a feed for you, just mashing them together in a playlist, you lose the context. Now, Spotify has this AI DJ now, which actually does like block programming and will come in and tell you in a AI synthesized version of Xavier's voice that, here's some black metal next. And then he'll algorithmically mispronounce all the band names. So it's possible to do. I didn't have the tools to do it when I was there.
Rob Drew had a question about hyperpop.
Yes, thank you. Glenn, I'm wondering if you could say anything about how hyperpop went from something that barely had a name, I think, in 2018. It was something that was done by just scattered people at various SoundCloud sites and things like that, to something that blew up to the point where it had 300,000 followers. The playlist on Spotify, what sort of, if any, backstage knowledge or any thoughts you'd offer on that?
This was a super interesting thing to watch happen. Spotify didn't have a hyperpop playlist. Hyperpop wasn't on the genre list, and I had this software called the genre miner, which would go wander around in the data looking for clusters of artists that were not yet associated with genres, either not at all or not in that organization. And it would surface these for me. You could never automatically say those are communities or those are genres. A person had to look at them, because often there'd be some other reason, like, oh, these are all in the same label, or they were all in this one talent show or something, and you'd have to make a human decision about whether that constituted a community that you cared about. But this community of Discord raised, like, weird, glitchy, high-pitched vocal synth pop something, electro something, was there. And I happen to know a bunch of those artists from my own listening. And so I was like, oh yeah. You're right. Those do go together. I understand how those go together. And then I had this bookmark folder full of, like, maybe this would be a genre eventually, that I sort of got from this algorithmic searching process, but that required more investigation and study and stuff. So hyperpop was like that. It lived in my bookmark folder for like a couple months as I sort of paid more attention to my own listening to it, and would follow up on connections. I'm going to go, like, look up these artists and find out that these ones knew each other, and that would give me more things to follow. So eventually I added it. I had enough knowledge and enough artists pulled together to add it to the genre map. And, it was some of those artists were also getting a little notoriety from their music. And the editorial team at Spotify, which is mostly, like, very earnest music fans who make playlists because they like music, makes playlists for those things. And so that my internal tools for looking at music by genre helped do that. And then they made a hyperpop playlist. And then it gets weird, because that playlist became at once sort of validation and the corporate colonization of this organic community. And I mean, in some ways, my genre map was doing that too, but I sort of tried to maintain the illusion that I was reporting on the world without, perturbing it. But obviously, it's not true. But the playlist then was definitely doing that, and I I could then watch like down to the individual tweet level, like bickering between people who did or didn't think of themselves as hyperpop, or were mad that they were considered hyperpop, or mad that they weren't. And if they were not, that then being on the playlist was like, how can you say I'm not hyperpop? I'm on the hyperpop playlist. I'm like, or I'm in the genre. I'm like, dude, that's like me and like Lizzie made the playlist. Like there's just people here. Like none of this is really. There's no authority here. This is how communities work. Like they look different from different angles, and you think you're in them, and you are, but then to somebody else, you're farther from the center than you think of yourself. So I don't really have any. I don't have any answers to that. I'm not even sure I have questions exactly, but that's definitely that there's a cycle that stuff goes through. And I think if you read the history of pretty much anything, you see that this is true about how things happen to be. Like the punk scene in London is a lot like the hyperpop scene on Discord. Like there are many of the same things, and people culturally involved in it whose music doesn't sound like the others, and then people who break out of it, and then years later we'll have the hyperpop version of Sting, and we'll all hate it.
Thank you. That's a great answer.
Speaking of community, Lucy March actually had a question specifically about that term and its purchase in this space.
Yeah, that's a perfect transition. Yeah, thank you. I really appreciate the answer to the last question. But yeah, this stems from sort of my own struggles in my dissertation, trying to figure out how to refer to these community or these, spaces, including hyperpop, where you have, people sort of gathering around music in largely digital spaces. And you seem to have settled on the word community. Am I right in thinking that? Is there a specific reason for that?
I mean, it's the group of people is the thing that I realized was what I was after, and group seemed too weak. So yeah, I called it community. But I have the luxury of not having to produce a dissertation or defend a dissertation, and my book is not academic, and yes, Jen is the only other person cited in my book, and for diegetic reasons, because like we actually met. It's not a literature review. So I think for me, yeah, community fits, and if I talk about community and genre together, then it tells a story about how those two ideas inform each other, whether that stands up to the rigors of your PhD supervisors or not. I have no idea.
That's great. Thank you.
Catherine Parrish had a question, maybe also a comment as well, but specifically a question about your relationship or possible antipathy to machine learning as a method.
Thank you. Yeah, I was kind of picking up on a little bit of an antipathy, and I'll put it right up front. I'm very much a geek, and I don't know that I necessarily see a marked distinction between machine learning and the work and algorithm. I mean, to me, machine learning is algorithms, and algorithms is machine learning. And I don't think that I feel like machine learning always has a human designing it. So, and I know that's I'm drawing very broad categories there, but I think machine learning has knobs. I mean, it's at the end of the day, machine learning is programmed. So I'm curious about the distinction you make between the way that, well, or your antipathy, if I may say, to how machine learning can do things that we would like it to do for guiding us to the stuff we love in music. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, so there's a chapter about this in the book, and I talk about two different kinds of machine learning. And basically, the distinction for me is if you're using a fancy method to figure out the adjustment of knobs and you can see the results and determine whether they're good or not, then I'm okay with that. Like that's like an automatic car. Like I don't consider it a offense to transportation when the car shifts the gears for you, even if it results in you not really understanding about gears. It's fine with me. The other kind, though, is the kind that just optimizes results independent of what they are. So this is what I was talking about with like things that are designed to just maximize listening time or the number of songs played independent of what they are. And if you run that without being you can't really iterate on that the same way. Like you can't produce a result, look at it and say, this was supposed to be German hip hop and half of these people are Polish. Let's do it again. If you're controlling the knobs, whether those knobs are math or machine learning, then you can try to fix that. You can twist them and see, do the Polish people go up or down? Like, is my German hip hop list more German and more hip hop now or less? If the machine is determining the knobs and all you get is, did people listen more or less, then you can't do that, and then you can't make progress. So if you'll enjoy that chapter, that's a geeky chapter.
I very much want to read the book, and I think, I mean, with all due respect, I think the machine is never controlling the knobs, right? The machine is always designed, right? It's always
that doesn't mean the human hand can be on the knobs in the middle or on the knobs at the end.
Fair enough. Fair enough. And that I think we should, I think we understand each other, and let's end it there because it could go on yes. Thank you. I really enjoyed this.
Elena Rezlagova has a few questions. Do you want to prioritize one, Elena, and then if we have time, we can get to the others as well?
Yeah, I think I'm just gonna ask one, as I said, because like some of them are just like, what about this and what about that? So I'm interested in the way the learning of the machine learning changed between Echo Nest and the Spotify mode. And from what you, I should say I didn't read that chapter yet, but I have the book and I'm looking forward to. So the Echo Nest used to scrape the internet for discourse around music. And I'm not clear whether that's still happening or whether that has been abandoned. If it's still happening, then now that a lot of discourse is AI generated and some NLP project, natural learning processing projects that were focused on human world usage through like intake of internet data, they're actually shutting down as a result because there's no way to determine what's human usage and what's AI usage. If that is not happening anymore, and considering my point too, where there is this criticism of Piola at Spotify, where the company apparently can play certain songs in certain playlists, if that's favorable to, say, large companies. Is that true or not? But also another kind of feature that people have talked about was curated playlists. Like, what is happening with the algorithm now? Like, who is doing what and how it is evolving? Is it evolving in a machine learning way, or is it evolving in Spotify managers deciding what goes where in various ways? Yeah.
That was one question that had like 8 sub questions, which I can briefly answer as yes, yes, no, yes, 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 and yes. So at the Echo Nest, we scraped the web because we didn't have direct listening data. That's really all there was to it. Scraping the web allowed us to pretend like we knew what people were listening to by the proxy of what they were writing about. And it was far more convincing than it had any right to be. But would go just terribly wrong because it relied on being able to know what entities are being described in a body of text. And if that's Justin Bieber, then there's only one famous Justin Bieber and it works pretty well. And if it's Chicago, then you're in for a world of pain. And like the hazing ritual for a new engineer at the Echo Nest was to do anything with the band, just like pick a thing, like try to do anything that made any sense of internet commentary about a very famous, well-known band called The Band, and it was hopeless. When we got acquired, I mean, this is basically why we got acquired by Spotify, because they understood that for us to do a good job of recommendations, we needed listening data, and they weren't going to give us listening data if we were powering their competitors, even though we promised that we'd keep it in a server on the whole other side of the closet where we had our servers. Honestly, but it would have been fine. But they basically acquired us so that they could give us the data so that we could do the statistical jobs well. And so the main place where this fed in was in the fans also like list on artist pages. So that was at the Echo Nest, we had an artist similarity graph that was based entirely on web discourse, and Spotify had a version of that was based entirely on collaborative filtering. And when I got there, we made it into a hybrid that was basically, it was mostly collaborative filtering and shared audience for artists that had sizable audiences. And then it fell back to the web scraped terms for, well, that was always involved, but it only really came into play majorly for smaller artists. And the problem with that was the smaller an artist you are, the worse that data is going to be. And if you poked around long enough, you could find just ridiculous examples of this where like obscure bands with just ordinary word names, their fans also like list would be just other words that were like that, even though the bands had nothing in common because they didn't have listening patterns. And like, yes, the words government and committee appear in a lot of web pages together. And so it'd say, you like this band government, here's this band committee. And the, government is like some trance DJ from Bulgaria, and committee is a ska band from the 1960s, and it didn't make any sense at all. So over the years, I've redesigned that system many times, and my sort of technical triumph at Spotify, out of all the things I did, was before I left, before I knew I was going to be leaving sometime last year, I finally took out the terms entirely, and the fans also like feature became literally what it says, fans also like. And there's complicated non-trivial math to quantify what it means to be a fan instead of a listener, and what sharing an audience means when the audiences are different sizes. But so to answer your original question, as far as I know, there is now nothing left at Spotify that relies on web scraped words, so we can breathe a sigh of relief that the destruction of intelligible discourse by AI is at least not affecting our playlist generation. However, there will be many more rounds of algorithms, and yes, Spotify will almost assuredly try to make playlists with large language models, which are trained on all that text again. And so the doom is always threatening us. We can never be complacent.
Thank you.
Elena, did you want to ask a question about demonetization?
Oh, well, sure. We'll have a short answer, I'm sure. So, in relation to paying the artists, what about the new Spotify policy requiring tracks to get a minimum of 1,000 listens every year to receive royalties? to me, that means that some artists will not get paid at all. So their contracts with labels or whatever other things they'd worked out won't really matter, because there will be a share of $0 for artists that are not that popular.
Although I wasn't thrilled to be laid off by Spotify, I have been okay with it. And in multiple times since I was laid off, I've thought to myself, I don't have to worry about whether to quit over that. And to me, that demonetization of songs that don't get 1,000 streams is the worst kind of corporate nonsense. It's economically regressive. It's thus morally bankrupt, and it doesn't even benefit anybody enough to justify it pragmatically. It at most it benefits, like it's 0.5%. So at most, and the harm is asymmetrically distributed, but the benefit is uniformly distributed. So nobody does any better than 0.5% more. So yeah, Taylor Swift earns, I don't know, $250,000 more dollars, or some real amount. Like it's got a real number of digits, but it's a literally trivial part of her earnings. She won't notice that. You would notice, but you won't get it. That's my least favorite kind of abusive tactic, is abusing the least powerful for trivial benefit to the most powerful. And the only reason they get away with it is in practice, it's trivial in both directions. Like if you don't make that limit, then you were going to make, $3 from that song in a year, and you weren't going to make a living. And there are a couple of very specific cases of artists who produce work in a particular way so that they were making a slightly non-trivial amount from a lot of songs that get a few listens each, and not all of those are gimmicky, but there are only a few of them. So it basically doesn't matter, except that it's morally wrong and economically regressive, and they should be ashamed of themselves.
Thank you. I had a quick question, maybe as we wrap things up. I was curious to hear, maybe to sort of pick up what Carl was saying at the end of your conversation about contextualized information. I would be curious to hear a lot more about like the labor involved in fleshing out liner notes. I remember anecdotally when Sergio Mendes passed that I was talking with Caleb Goldschmidt about how they had to like correct some of the translated Portuguese in the interface. And so I would just, particularly since my understanding of liner notes historically is like that's sort of handled by the label, at least in like the physical media era. I'd be curious to hear more about the work involved in putting that information on Spotify.
I mean, it would not be technically hard to just literally take, a PDF of liner notes or an image or something and put it up. It's not hard on Spotify's side. The hard part is adjusting all the industry pipelines that deal with that data, and then getting everybody to provide that data in the right format. And if you want to make it navigable, like if you want to be able to click on, the bass player on an album and see the other albums that that bass player played on, then you're a long way from that, because we don't have disambiguation at that level in the industry data flows, and all that information is like typed into text fields somewhere at a label. So there's a lot of work to go before your bass player's name is correct and could be used for navigation. And we haven't even really got the artists correct, the main artists correct, as you'll discover if you follow Release Radar and are constantly getting like, oh, a new album by Sleep. I love Sleep. Oh no, it's another bunch of terrible lullaby versions of Doja Cat songs.
Well, we will leave it there. Thank you very much for your time, Glenn. Really robust conversation. Just a reminder, on October 8th, we will be returning to have a conversation with Franz Nicolai and Steve Hayden about Franz's new book, Band People, Life and Work in Popular Music. which just came out on UT Press. And that'll be October 8th at 5:30 Eastern time. Thanks, everybody.